Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the Future of Retail in the Landlord-Tenant Relationship with Meghann Martindale, Global Head of Retail Research for CBRE. As a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, to please submit them using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thanks so much, Drew, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's really exciting conversation. We have a great report out this week entitled Facing the Challenges of Modern Retail with Prescriptive Analytics. It discusses current operational challenges which many of us are facing in retail and how to address them. Zebra Technologies was our partner in the research of this report, and we at Coresight are honored to have the opportunity to research and advise our clients on the intersection of retail, real estate, and technology. This year, unlike any other, we have been providing answers to questions that have never been asked before, as have many of you, as this environment continues to remain incredibly dynamic. One of the reasons we're so excited to have Meghann here with us today. Meghann serves as the Global Head of Retail Research for CBRE. In this key thought leadership role, she generates industry-leading research, trend analysis, and insights affecting the ongoing evolution, and right now, revolution of retail. Applying her vast leasing and development experience, Meghann provides practical application of her research and thought leadership to portfolio optimization and value creation. She is an active member of the ICSC's North American Research Group, and she and I have had many active debates in this group together. Thanks for joining us today, Meghann.
Great, thanks, Deborah. I'm happy to be with you.
This is truly the hottest topic right now, the relationships that retailers have with their landlords, and what the future of physical retail looks like. I know you've been speaking to many in the industry. What are your thoughts in terms of how, where are we and where are we going, and how do we work together to get there?
Yeah, and I think, look, it's so layered. I mean, there's so many different elements to this, but I think if I had one overarching statement, place still matters. Stores are still going to matter. I think that's incredibly sometimes difficult to keep at the forefront of our mind when we're seeing the shutdowns, we're seeing all the news around the ecom migration, during the retail closures, we're seeing now phased new closures and setbacks in the reopening. So it is easy to lose sight of, and it's easy to jump to the conclusion that, this is the final nail in the coffin in retail stores and everything's going to migrate online. But I think we've already seen a couple key elements to show that the store does still matter. It still matters to consumers. We saw a lot of pent up demand with consumers coming back into the stores upon reopening. And we also are seeing the store play a really new and vital role in terms of what retailers can do to meet the customer where they are, how the omnichannel works, and what the store's role is in ecom fulfillment, in addition to that store engagement and that store experience that has been the foundation of retail the last several years, but that we're certainly seeing changing amidst the pandemic and amidst consumers kind of pulling back with caution from being out shopping the physical environment.
We're seeing very interesting and unique ways that retailers are using their physical footprint right now, right? Some are selling out of stores that are not opened, right? There's curbside pickup, buy online pickup in store, which continues to grow at a rapid pace. How do we think about the future of lease and rent structure? What's happening with some of the co-tenancy challenges? I mean, this is a lot to think about. But if we think about where we are today, how do we, how are landlords negotiating with tenants, especially as rents are, as leases are coming up for renewal and rents are due?
Yes, I think there's a couple different elements. So, the first element has been obviously through sort of the triage phase, right, of the closures and rent deferrals while retailer stores were closed. And then what this reemergence has looked like, what the reentries look like as they've been reopening, knowing that a lot of that has been on reduced capacity. So we've been in this mode the last several months of, what is that short-term sort of agreement look like between landlords and tenants, and how are they working together to get through this? And certainly it's on the financial side of rents, right? But then it was also a lot of additional support around operations and how quickly, retailers and landlords had to pivot to facilitate curbside, to make sure that the, safety and, social distancing measures were all in place, around marketing, and really communication to the consumers being a key component of the last several months. I mean, we've, in working with our property management group, I can't emphasize enough how important the communication side has been. And that is everything from who's open, what are your hours of operation, what are you doing for safety measures, where's signage, where's curbside. I mean, there's all these different elements that were going on that required a lot of collaboration just from an operational standpoint, in addition to them addressing the rent issues during the last several months. And now we're heading into the next wave of, okay, what does the future of the store look like? How are we going to look at its involvement, both from, traditional physical sales, but then also that increased role in fulfillment, in curbside, in buy online, pick up in store, the fact that we've been seeing a lot of the stores used for returns. However, it is important to note that when we look globally, we've seen across EMEA, APAC, and the US, that consumer average ticket is up significantly, anywhere from 10 to 35%, no matter, depending on where you are. So they're clearly also buying in the store. It's not just using it as another e-com platform. But the question around what the store's purpose is going forward is really going to guide, what do rent structures look like? What do lease structures look like? How do you address some of the co-tenancy issues, knowing that, obviously we're going to get hit by some vacancies with store closures. Either it's because of bankruptcies or because retailers are looking at their store fleets in new ways and how to optimize them. So look, it's a question everybody wants the answers to in terms of what is this lease structure, going to look like going forward, because there's so many different elements that need to be incorporated. And a lot of that too is around the transparency that's needed in, looking at the integration of e-com and brick and mortar sales and how you differentiate between those, and where the lines get blurred between buy online, pick up in store, and curbside that integrates both.
Meghann, we've talked about the Coresight estimate of 25,000 store closures permanent in 2020, and that 3 to 5 years out, we expect 25% of traditional malls to also close. Those numbers could be low in light of some of the changes we're already seeing, and kind of early July here with regards to stores that had opened, thinking about kind of reversing that, or having to reverse that. What happens with all of this vacant real estate, and what's the future of the anchor look like, and what's its purpose?
And look, this is one of those trends that, is the buzzword of today, that this was already happening and it's accelerated. We were already seeing the mall vulnerability. We were already seeing the demise of the department store in some cases. So I wouldn't say any of this is new news. I think that the challenge is, as an industry, we thought we probably had another 5 to 10 years to solve for all of this. And that truly accelerates. So the issues that we've been preparing, whether you're a retailer on the operational side or you're an investor, owning the assets that, with the retailers that occupy the space, we thought we still had more time to kind of figure out what the solutions are. Clearly, we're having to make, those decisions and come up with those strategies a lot faster. I think part of the challenge is that some of the uses that have been around, mixed use and repurposing, that were really guiding a lot of the retail redevelopment and retail repositioning, we've seen those sectors under threat as well. We're trying to figure out what happens with the office space and what the need is going forward with work from home. Obviously hotels have been hit hard, multifamily in certain categories. So I think the challenge is, it's going to take some time, and it's frustrating that it's going to take some time to see how sort of all these sectors, reemerge at a time when we're having to really strategically roll up our sleeves and try to figure out what to do with retail assets today. But I do think it's going to take several quarters to really see the impact, to get our arms around, okay, what is vacancy? Who's closed? What is sort of the future look like for these individual assets? And I will say that there is a huge regional variation with this. There is no more one size fits all solution to looking at repositioning assets. It is truly going to vary regionally. If you're in a growth market, if you're in a market that's contracting, if you're in a market that is, you know, was heavily over retailed going into this. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. And I keep kind of talking about the tale of two recoveries. You know, it looks very different around the country, depending if you're in an urban market, a suburban market, you know, a secondary market. And we're really having to look at what these migration patterns look like, what the new norm's going to be for office where people live, work, and how they shop before we can kind of come back and really roll up our sleeves on an individual asset basis level to put repositioning plans in place.
I think you bring up something incredibly important around these regional differences. I think early on in this pandemic, there had been concerns about some of these, you know, let's call them A properties in gateway cities. But from everything we've seen and the data that's come out, those, you know, those properties have, you know, not only kind of survived, but they've thrived. How has your thought process changed around, you know, kind of, if you will, an A property, or, you know, these properties that had really been supporting tourism and whatnot? What have you seen, and what do you think we continue to see?
I think there's a couple different dynamics there. So first off, you know, every conversation around retail now, you have to sort of separate out the different segments. So the conversation around what happens with grocery anchored centers is incredibly different than what happens with malls and, you know, tourism based entertainment and things like that. I think, you know, the grocery anchored segment has sort of been the darling of the industry the last couple of years, and this just, you know, takes it to sort of new heights, if you will. When you start getting into, though, the other asset classes, and you start to look at the malls, and you start to look at, you know, properties that are highly dependent on tourism, you know, I think part of the challenge is the A assets, as we would have defined them pre-COVID, you know, now have the problems that sort of the B and C assets had pre-COVID. We have vacancy exposure. Investors are going to have to, you know, there's a real lack of clarity around what rent rolls are going to be, both from vacancy, rent restructuring, lease restructuring, you know, what new deals are going to look like. So I still am a firm believer that the, you know, the A assets in great markets are going to still clearly serve a purpose, but I think there's going to be a big shift around how those are merchandised and what kind of reach they have. And we're also having to really look at how the markets are performing and reacting. So we were already seeing this big migration trend pre-COVID, and we just completed a study we'll be putting a report out on shortly about what we think the top markets are for recovery. And if you look at that, there's several that were sort of on the migration list before. They were seeing a huge influx from, you know, either millennials or baby boomers, combination of both. And, you know, some of those are only going to continue to grow and continue to accelerate. There are, however, some markets that we're going to see some reversal of that trend in. And, you know, those are the markets that you have some caution over, because you've seen these huge growth trajectories, but you've seen incredible economic impact in certain sectors that, you know, will slow that down in the coming years. And you know, we're probably, the recovery rate's going to change. We're probably looking at a 2 to 3 year recovery rate, and it depends largely where you are in the markets. We're both in New York City, so New York City is going to probably have a much longer road to recovery, given how, you know, hard we've been hit. And, you know, so all of those things come into play in terms of looking at, you know, kind of what the future is of these assets, where they're located, what was their merchandising mix before, and how is that going to shift coming out, and then what's happening with both the demographic trends and those consumer patterns.
If we think about the purpose in terms of why many people go to the mall, right? It's, and that's potentially changing and will accelerate, but a lot of it had been right around entertainment, retailtainment, you know, kind of however you want to think about it. And much of that involved going to the movie theater, having, you know, kind of coffee or a meal. With the current challenges in this environment around all of that, how do those tenants who'd been paying rent or who had build outs done, what happens from here?
I mean, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question in our industry, right?
Well, think about how far I am down the list. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, you know, I think I'll start with sort of where the challenge is and hopefully flip it to an opportunity. But, you know, I think part of the challenge is everyone's been highly focused on what trends have accelerated. And I'm very vocal about paying attention to what trends have reversed, because again, there's migration to ecom, mixed use redevelopment, you know, shifts in the mall and department store landscape. We all knew that was coming. Once again, it's just accelerating how fast we have to deal with it. Where I've been more concerned, if you will, through the effects of all of this is the trends that have been the driving force in our industry. And you mentioned them all: entertainment, F&B, fitness, health and wellness, you know, and this temporary stop in all of it, and how it's impacting those operators. And we're seeing, you know, many at-risk retailers in those categories who were healthy going into this, but because of the full shutdown and, you know, now kind of these rolling risks of future shutdowns, you know, they've been impacted hard. And I think I think eventually that all starts to come back. But the challenge is, okay, what does this reemergence look like in this environment? How do we get people comfortable coming back into dining out? What happens with the movie theaters? What happens with the gyms? You know, these are the concepts that honestly, I spend the most time really rolling up my sleeves diving into, because this is where I think we have the most risk. These are the types of categories that we were really banking on for retail, and we merchandised around the last several years, and there's going to be a big shift in that. And, you know, we have to acknowledge that there's going to be some fallout. I do think health and wellness, especially when you look at, you know, all of the medical and healthcare and how proactive people are being around that category, I think that continues to thrive. I think we'll have to look at how that operates and, you know, look at new concepts, but we're seeing a lot of growth and a lot of early growth coming back out of it in that category. I think fitness is going to be, you know, obviously challenged just because of the way it's operated traditionally. So that's going to come down to, you know, how it's operated, who the operators are, you know, and what kind of happens here the next 12 months. I think we will have to look at a lot of repositioning for some of the entertainment space, but I don't think that goes away. I think it comes back. I think it's just, unfortunately, it's a longer recovery time than you're going to see with, you know, soft goods or fashion and some of the other more static categories.
Meghann, as I've thought about kind of, you know, what the ideal mall is, right? And have talked to many, you know, this idea of kind of live, work, play, right? I can get my dry cleaning done. I can get my shoes fixed. I can, you know, kind of drop my kids off to go, you know, kind of play amongst themselves in some kind of, you know, facility. Maybe I can hop in and take a workout. But this idea, right, that there's an opportunity to spend more of your time at a mall. And, you know, potentially the anchors start to evolve, right? Maybe we see grocery, you know, we bring the drugstores back to the malls. But, you know, if we were to all kind of probably sketch out what would be right for each of us, I assume it's somewhat similar. This idea of, can we do everything in one location, right? This idea of we're all time constrained. How does this idea, that opportunity we have right now is to rethink the purpose of the mall? I mean, you know, some out of necessity and some out of opportunity, but how does that come into play? And how do you think about this, you know, lifestyle centers, town centers, but in more of a traditional mall?
Yeah, and I think there's two big topics around that, or two big trends. So first off, we are seeing globally that consumers are more comfortable returning to outdoor shopping environments versus enclosed malls. And so while we have seen certain malls who've been off the charts with traffic coming back when they're the dominant retail, you know, environment in a trade area, so it's not to say that the traffic is not coming back to the malls, but we have seen a stronger recovery overall in the outlet centers, the lifestyle centers, the town centers, and that. So I think there's a component there, and we're again already seeing this happen, but I think we'll see it more. You know, when you're looking at the malls and you're looking at the need to reposition some of these department stores and anchor locations, is there an element to create an open air environment? Is there an element to create a town center piece of it? And again, that's an acceleration. You know, I think the other key component that is really consumer based, and that again we're seeing this globally, it's this idea of, you know, patriotic shopping. Consumers are sticking much closer to home. They're not making the big long treks to go visit, you know, these big retail, you know, sort of the mega mall or the big regional centers. They want to stick closer to home, first off, because obviously we've had some, you know, mobility restrictions, and then just the safety factor and kind of feeling that, you know, less cautious about being close to home, right? But there's another element, which is, you know, consumers, and there's been a ton of surveys done on this. ICSC did a great one about a month ago. that show that consumers really want to support their local economies and their mom and pop operators and the small businesses that are in their communities. And so I think that's a really key element to looking at, you know, how do these shopping centers and malls really fill that need for consumers where they can get everything they want closer to home and they don't have to make a, you know, depending on where you are in the country, a 20 to a 50-mile trek to get the type of retail that they need. So I think that's honestly where a lot of the opportunity lies. And look, if you're a retail destination that's largely dependent on international tourism, this is a very different conversation. You know, we don't know when that international travel is fully going to open back up. But when you look at domestically and, you know, until the recent spikes that really kicked in 2 weeks ago, you know, we were seeing a lot more domestic mobility and people, the idea of the staycation and people kind of, you know, staying in their home states or staying, you know, regionally close and spending those dollars in hospitality and retail in those markets. And I think that's where the big opportunity is going to be. You know, we've been all about globalization the last few years, and now we're sort of contracting back into a very, very localized environment. But if a shopping center owner and a retailer can really tap into that, there's huge opportunity to capture that customer who's going to be, you know, sticking closer to home for the foreseeable future versus off, you know, traveling the world.
I mean, as we think about capturing this customer, you know, the in-store experience, the mall experience, it has been really critical. And we've spoken to many retailers who said, right, if they could wave a magic wand with the investments that they've made in stores and in-store technology over the past 18 months, they really wish that they had started to spend that on e-commerce and last mile. If this thought process continues, what happens to the stores and the purpose of the store, the role of the store? Like, what is the store of the future? Mm-hmm. Is it just for returns of product people buy online, or is there a greater role?
I think there's absolutely a greater role. I think that is a component of it we can't deny. I am not trying to, you know, sort of minimalize that, or trivialize it in any way. But I think the biggest thing that I come back to is seeing how many consumers return to the stores. I mean, we were back at 70, 80% of traffic and sales in a lot of markets only a few weeks after opening. And in some cases we hit 90 and even 100. Store still matters. It matters to the consumer. Yes, they are going to use it in new ways. I'm less concerned about them just using it as a, you know, a return center, because we're seeing the uptick in the you know, per ticket item in the basket size coming out of, and that's coming out of the stores. So they are using the stores for fulfillment, for return, you know, for what they buy online and pick up either in the store or curbside. But while they're there, and again, this is because we've had the shift to much more intentional kind of purposeful shopping. I'm going on a mission, right? I'm not going to just necessarily go cross shop and window shop as much as I used to, but I'm hitting these stores. Here's a list of what I need. And oh, by the way, when they're there, they're seeing that impulse buy, you know, that they haven't seen. So I think the store still matters. I think what we are really seeing retailers do is reevaluate how does that store role sort of transition and evolve from, okay, this is purely sort of experience-based and this emotional connection, to how can consumers conveniently and effectively use the store to fulfill that, you know, those purchases, whether they come from the store or whether they come from online. And, you know, we were talking about this heavily pre-COVID. We've been moving towards a better integration of brick and mortar and ecom. We've been sort of ecom versus brick and mortar for many, many years. And now we were, you know, even pre-COVID, we were looking at the need to really create a more seamless business model. And now we see it even more, because we know that even with this huge surge in online spending through COVID, you know, it didn't offset the sales lost from the physical store. And so we're starting to kind of recapture some of that, you know, as the stores reopen. I think retailers going forward are really taking a pause to reevaluate, yeah, where's my CapEx going? Most retailers, you know, or many retailers are putting expansion of new stores on hold until they take a step back and say, okay, let's figure out how to optimize our current fleet. Are we reaching consumers in the right markets and in the right locations? And how do we spend the dollars on that integration versus a very, you know, clear delineation that we've seen in the last several years between I'm putting these dollars towards ecom versus I'm putting these dollars towards a store experience. And we have to see that kind of come together in a more, functional and fluid way, both from an operational standpoint and then a financial standpoint.
I mean, I personally have always been a huge fan of the physical footprint because it allows retailers to tell their story and to share new ideas with customers, and also to start to, do more placemaking. However, as we're seeing this real acceleration, right? It's like we hit the acceleration button in terms of e-commerce. How, as a landlord, do you think about the rent structure when maybe the stores are the inspiration for the consumer then converting to online? How do the metrics work out, and just what's the overall thought process?
And it's the probably number one question these days. And we were already exploring this before all of this. So again, it's one of the issues that now has become, front and center. I think the challenge is, we used to just measure store productivity just on those sales. And now we have a complete, on the physical sales, and now we have this complete blurring of the line. So if I'm a landlord and I have a retailer, who has an ecom platform and has stores in my center, and, we're supporting that retailer with curbside and how that operates and marketing behind it and communication behind it, I want to get credit for those sales that are bought online, picked up in the store, or picked up via curbside, because the real estate is playing a valuable role in the retailer being able to, execute on those sales. And it is the big question right now of how do we measure it, and how do we incorporate that into leases? And part of the challenge, candidly, is just how retailers even delineate between those sales. Some retailers are very sophisticated and can say, yeah, we can track ecom sales versus brick and mortar sales and see where that overlap happens. There are a lot of retailers that surprisingly don't have that sophisticated of a model. If it's bought online, it's an ecom sale regardless of where it's, picked up. If it's bought in the store, it's registered to that store. So part of the transparency with landlords and how to restructure these deals comes back to sort of the retailer operations side of how do we get greater clarity around registering what the real estate value is in those ecom sales. And, this is going to require literally an overhaul, complete sort of, to use your word, revolution, not just in how the deals are structured, because the first step in that is being able to quantify it. And there's not, I wouldn't say there's many, retailers who have been able to successfully quantify how that bifurcates. And that's the data and the information that we need so we can see how those stores are participating and that the landlord does have participation in the sales that they're helping to generate, even if it originates online.
I mean, not to add to already a tough question, but we hear, right, from many that the reason that they purchase from said retailers because they know that they can return, in a physical box. So there's also that, right? I mean, that's, intangible really, but how do you kind of account for that as well? Or how do you think through that?
Well, and that's part of the problem. So if I put my landlord hat on, I'm not getting the benefit of an ecom sale that was picked up in store, but I'm getting the penalty if that was returned in store. And that needs to get fixed, and believe me, I wish I had the solution to share with everyone today. This is how we do it. I don't have that today, but that is a huge issue because it's been a double-edged sword. If you look at it from the landlord perspective, you're not getting the benefit of the sale, but you are getting penalized, even if that initial store had nothing to do, even if that store had nothing to do with the initial purchase. They could have bought it out of state and gotten home and they're returning it into that store, and there was no credit, for anything that was generated from the positive sales side ecom. So that is, one of many things that I think are the foundation of our industry that we're going to need to see, fairly rapid and big overhaul in, because those are the elements that then come together. Okay, how do I structure my leases? How do we look at rents going forward? We need that information and that transparency and that collaboration. And look, it doesn't happen overnight and everyone's trying to figure it out. This has certainly accelerated the issue, but it's also, I think, making everything very evident of how important it is to be able to delineate going forward as we're seeing greater integration with industrial side and, the ecom and then the physical retail side.
So we're hey, it's nice to get excited about, kind of the future of retail as we think about even in 2020, we've got back to school, we have holiday. Are there ways for landlords, in light of some of the challenges around kind of physical, large groups of people congregating, how can they kind of celebrate, right, some of these, and we've got many holidays, right? We've got Thanksgiving and we've got a Halloween and many in between, but are there ways for them to use their outlots, their out parcels? Are there ways to kind of generate excitement from the consumer and honestly from the retailers too? What are the ways that we see this collaboration continuing to really evolve?
Yeah, and I think you hit it. A lot of it is around programming and marketing, and I will say how we're redefining events. You think about the large scale events that used to happen, on site, but you think of Santa and you think of all these big, holiday fairs and things. And so I know that from an investor side and a property management side, it's a big question of how do you create that excitement? How do you support the community? How do you support your retailers, but you still do it in a safe way? So we're seeing a lot of really creative, cool things be born out of, combination of physical and VR events, micro events that are much more, sort of tailor-made to specific consumers or the communities that they're in versus these large scale events. And I think that's, part of the beauty of the innovation and the sort of ingenuity that's going to come out of this, because we have a lot of brilliant people in this industry. And, the creativity that we're seeing, even just with our property management group who I work closely with, I mean, they're doing incredibly creative, innovative things that probably would have done already or figured out in time, but they really just created that need. And, how do you re-engage with that consumer, bring them back into the community? But the big key is how do you also do it while giving them the comfort that you're doing it in a safe way, that you're respecting their caution and their concern in this interim period we have through the reentry, but that you're also still creating that buzz and that excitement and that reason to come back into the retail environment.
Great. So we have a few minutes. We have a lot of questions from our attendees. I'll dive into a few of them. They're all excellent. Thank you for asking. If we look at this wider shift or wider divide between smaller town versus urban Main Street retail, what does that look like, and how do you see things changing?
Yeah, that is just a hot topic as well, and this is really around the migration question, and look, we were already seeing migration patterns out of the big cities and out of the urban environments, New York, Chicago, so that's not new. And we've clearly seen an acceleration of that. And we're just starting to really be able to say, okay, what of the temporary migration out of the big cities during crisis is converting to permanent migration? To de-densify. And, the benefit to the secondary markets, the smaller towns, is that, people are gravitating towards that. They're feeling comfortable there. They're not in these big, dense urban environments. It's easier to social distance. You have more outdoor space, all of the logical reasons behind it. And I think one of the big structural shifts that we're going to see, just in the broader economy that's going to directly impact retail is what really happens around the office and the ability to work remote. Because, I think it's split, to be quite honest. And we talk about this all the time. There's going to be a lot of companies and a lot of the workforce, they want to get back into the office for a lot of reasons. But now you have that flexibility and employers can offer their employees more agility and giving them the optionality to work remote. And I think that's going to be part of the big trend going forward. So, as part of the workforce, if I don't want to live in the big city and get back into a big, Midtown Manhattan office, and I want the ability to live in these, smaller urban environments, I think that's going to drive a lot of that traffic. I'm not of the opinion that the city's dead and everybody leaves the city. I think as people start to feel safe again in the city and the affordability comes down, I do think we'll see some of the younger generation come back in, to the real urban environments. But I do think this is a buoy for, the secondary markets and the smaller towns that maybe we're fighting the migration out of those areas into the sort of flight to quality to the bigger urban markets. And now we're seeing sort of that retreat coming back in.
All right, I'm going to go to another question. How do malls plan to resource and launch fulfillment centers, especially when consumers are looking at new ways to approach product experience and product fulfillment?
Yeah, and I think, look, this is sort of a big forced experiment I think everybody's working on now. I mean, we can already look at a few malls around the country who had integrated a component of fulfillment in their malls, whether it was in part of an old, department store box or reuse of old, kind of back end space. So that's going to continue, I think, because of the regional reach of most malls and just how they're positioned. It's a logical progression to utilizing some of that space because you can very easily deploy and distribute to reach the communities that are in those markets. But again, I think at the risk of sounding a little vague on it, I think you really have to look at it on an asset by asset basis. I don't think the top malls in the country are going to convert to fulfillment centers. Absolutely not. I think they're going to, find new ways to adapt and sort of re-merchandise components, and they're going to continue to stay strong. I think the question becomes more in the, the B and C malls, which again, we were already seeing, the secondary markets where they have that regional reach to get to consumers and use that fulfillment deployment, but maybe they've been out positioned by the competition to maintain, the strongest retail positioning. So again, it's kind of that hybrid going forward. And I think you really have to look at it both regionally and then even in a specific market, asset by asset.
All right, last question. It's tough to pick from all these great ones. How do we think, right, D2C had significant amount of interest in going into the physical world. Do you think that there is, as there's amazing assets up for grabs, do you think that they're thinking about that to do that faster right before the holiday season, or is there a longer term kind of let's take a step back and rethink our physical footprint?
So it's a great question. I think there's sort of two answers. I think the holiday season is going to be very interesting this year. We don't know what economic conditions going to be. We don't know where we're going to be with the virus. We don't know if we're going to be back shopping retail in droves, or unfortunately, if we're still struggling with these sort of waves, it could largely be more online growth this holiday season. So I would kind of separate it out. I think this holiday season, it is going to be so key for retailers to capture every possible sale. I think they're going to deploy on all levels, if it's through the physical store, if it's through online, and then of course that sort of hybrid. I think longer term, there's a significant reevaluation going on between that customer reach. And so it's not just physical versus ecom, but then you look even through ecom, is it, who am I working with in terms of the marketplaces, the direct to consumer, the wholesale brands, so there's a lot of layers to that I think, the retailers that we talk to are really having to reevaluate where they have the most operational efficiency, where they can preserve the best margins, and where they can generate the most sales through all of those different, various platforms. And even now, as we're getting more into live commerce and social commerce, all of these new, new sales, point of sales. And so I think, I think holiday will probably shape a lot of how that looks going forward, but then it'll be a big push for sort of re-engineering all of that and what it looks like next year.
Absolutely, Meghann. I could ask you questions all day, but our time has come to a close. Thank you so much for joining us, and for everyone that tuned in, and for all your great questions. We hope to see you on our next conversation with Placer AI on Thursday at 10 a.m. next week. We'll be discussing really kind of taking this conversation and kind of looking at the next level of what happens in the recovery. Will it be a retail turning point or return to status quo? As a reminder, this and all previous webinars are available on our website to rewatch. Thanks so much for joining us. And Meghann, thanks again. This is an amazing opportunity for all of us.
Thank you so much.
Take
Be
care.
well.
Bye-bye.